Welcome to this BVD webinar, everybody. I'm only going to take 2 or 3 minutes of your time before handing back over to Scott. You can just move to the next slide, Scott. As the General Manager for IDEX here in New Zealand, I first up want to thank you for taking the time to join us for this session. It is obviously we're in unprecedented times, and whilst it's challenging for all of us as every day throws new challenges, we must, I think, count our blessings as we remember those that have been and are being directly affected by the global pandemic. Scott mentioned the C word. I'm sorry to mention it again, but COVID has really thrown all of us a curveball, but none more so than those that have lost loved ones and the countries that are currently really bearing the brunt of this devastating effect of the COVID pandemic. I mean, I think of Spain, Italy, the US, to name a few. So in these times, I firmly believe as a global community, we are stronger together. And just wanted to let you know that from an IDEX perspective, we will remain true to our purpose and principles and continue to support our veterinary communities by remaining open for business. You can just move to the next slide, Scott. A key part of what we do is research and development, and I'm very pleased from a veterinary perspective to say that we've been testing through, overseas for COVID in pets for a long time now. We developed a test, and I'm very pleased to say there is no evidence that we can find anywhere that COVID is, animals are involved with the transmission of COVID. So that can only be good news. Next slide. I promised I'd only talk to you for a couple of minutes, so I'm going to hand back over to Scott. But first up, I think it's worthwhile just to thank Scott and his team for everything they've done with this trial. Now, Scott's a well-known and highly respected member in the New Zealand veterinary and dairy science community. He's been involved in the dairy industry for over 25 years, and he's worked as a clinical veterinarian, a university teacher, a researcher, and working as a scientist for Dairy Research Corporation, which is now, of course, Dairy NZ. I think he received his PhD from Massey in 1994. He's a registered specialist in dairy cattle reproduction and is an adjunct professor at the School of Veterinary Sciences for Massey. I think it's fair to say that throughout Scott's career, he's been actively involved in improving animal health and productivity through research and involvement in strategic industry-wide initiatives. He's also been involved in teaching and training, presenting at local and international farmer, scientific and veterinary conferences, and there's been a few awards along the way as well. I won't go through all of them. You've been a committee member of the Dairy Cattle Vets Veterinarians and the Epidemiology branch of the NZVA. He's currently editorial board member for the Journal of Dairy Science and an ad hoc reviewer for a number of other journals. He's authored or co-authored over 100 peer-reviewed publications and done more than 300 conference presentations. So I'm sure, despite the changed circumstances, Scott, you'll take this one in your stride. In 1997, Scott established the R&D division of Anexa called Cognosco, and Cognosco has been involved in creating evidence-based veterinary medicine by undertaking large-scale field studies, consultancy and industry reviews for many years. Core areas of interest include improving reproductive performance of dairy herds, control and treatment of infectious diseases such as mastitis, metabolic diseases of cattle, and prudent use of antimicrobials. And for today's hour, we're going to include BVD on that topic. So Scott, thank you very much. Take it away.
Okay, thanks for that introduction, Carl. So yeah, as you can gather, the topic of today's discussion is the BVD testing of calves. And I don't need to tell this audience, but oops, it's going to be a bit temperamental. The mechanism of transmission of BVD is a really interesting one in the sense that where a naive cow or a persistently infected cow is pregnant, that fetus may become immunotolerant to the BVD virus. And this is particularly in that window between about 30 and 110, 120 days of gestation. If that calf survives, it, as I said, it becomes persistently infected and really becomes a major virus factory, shedding viruses around the environment. Now, if that particular animal does survive to adulthood and gets pregnant, it in turn then generates a PI itself, but of course also it can create PIs by horizontal transmission to other early gestation animals. So what do we know about BVD status in New Zealand? There's some early work 15, 20 years ago looking at BVD antibodies, some work we did in fact, and Heinrich Vogt published. At that stage, both studies actually came up with the same number, which was 93% of herds had evidence of BVD exposure. There was BVD antibodies in bulk tank milk in those studies. Andrew Weir went on as part of his PhD work to look at prevalence of PIs and found that 9% of North Island herds and 32% of South Island herds had evidence of PIs. Now, life's moved on and more recent data would suggest that the numbers are a bit lower than that, but it's just a reminder that the BVD is endemic, it's right across the country. In terms of the economic impact, there's been research work done all over the world, and this is just a graph, a picture from a recent meta-analysis. And what they've done here is used maps around the world and colour-coded the estimates of economic impact in terms of US dollars per cow per year of BVD. So, for example, at one extreme, if you look at the US studies and the Dutch studies, they were estimating the BVDs costing more than $400 per cow per year. The New Zealand estimates in the map in the top right there, a bit lower, sort of between 50 and 100 US dollars per cow per year. But, you know, whichever way you look at it, BVD is an expensive disease. It also has very direct effect on animals. And this is some work from Heinrich Vogt, again, going back 15, 20 years, where he looked at BVD PIs, so the PI animals in terms of their non-PI cohort mates. And so what you can see in the top left of the screen there is the live weight of the non-PI animals in blue and PI animals in orange. And by the end of the 21-month period, there was a nearly 70 kilo difference in live weight. Now, also looking at survival, again, the non-PI animals are in blue and the PI are in orange, and the x-axis in this case is in months out to 24 months, so 4 years of age. And what you can see is non-PI animals, you know, nearly 90% of them survived out to 4 years of age, but only about 20% of PI animals survived to 4 years of age. So very high mortality and loss rate amongst PIs. In terms of milk production, PI animals have about half the milk yield of non-PI animals in the same herd. So massive impact on production. And then finally, in this table, we can see the effect of having BVD, being a BVD PI, on the risk of other disease. So the odds ratio for mastitis, for example, is 17 times higher in a PI animal than a non-PI animal. And similarly, the risk of sudden illness or sudden death, severe illness, I should say, is about 12 times higher in a PI than a non-PI animal. So, you know, PIs in and of their own right are problem animals, as we might expect. And this is not even starting to think about the impact of PI animals on transmission to other animals in the herd. Now, in terms of control, and we're all very familiar with this, you know, there's really the two major strategies. One is to test and slaughter, so identify and remove the PI animals. And the second is then managing biosecurity, so we don't reintroduce BVD to a herd. And I just want to note here that all of the programs internationally and the local program do advocate testing of calves. So calf testing is a really core part of BVD control programs. The other point I'd make, and the two New Zealand studies on the economics of control measures, so Michael Reichel's study in the mid-2000s and Andrew Weir's in his PhD, was that doing something, managing BVD, is better than not managing BVD. And it doesn't really matter, well, it does matter what you do, and the more you do, the better, but basically doing something is better than doing nothing. So intervening in terms of BVD is the right thing to do both from a welfare and biological point of view, but also an economic point of view. Now, turning to the more specific recommendations from the BVD Steering Committee, and it's great, there's been a great body of work here that's available to all of us. And within the Dairy Toolkit, which I'm sure everybody's familiar with, but the whole define, assess, action and monitor sort of process, one of the key messages that comes through in that material is that we need to screen young stock for PI. So whether the herd has evidence of recent exposure, so the bulk tank milk S/P ratio is greater than 1, so those very highly likely affected herds, right through to herds with a lower SP ratio that probably haven't had recent exposure to BVD and are unlikely to have a PI in the herd at the current time, all of these herds would benefit from screening of young stock. So the recommendation of the BVD Steering Committee is, irrespective of the current status of the herd in terms of PIs in the milking herd, we should still be thinking about incoming young stock as a source of potential reinfection or of infection of the herd. Now, as most of you are also aware, there have been some concerns raised about testing of calves, and this is based on the fact that there is good evidence that maternal antibodies persist for up to 30 weeks, or in some studies up to 40 weeks after birth. And so it's been demonstrated, and I'll show you some data in a minute, that with some tests and in some situations, the presence of maternal antibodies may interfere with tests. And so, there's been advice that we do delay testing of calves out to 35 days of age, but there are some implications of that. So if we look at what the BVD Steering Committee is recommending, they're certainly saying let's screen calves at a younger age rather than wait till they enter the milking herd, and that makes a lot of sense. Waiting for 2 years after a potential PI animal is created because of the damage it's going to do along the line. But within the current BVD Steering Committee recommendations, highlighted here in yellow, sorry about that, still saying let's test older than 35 days of age. And that advice is really based on data such as represented here, where 5 PI animals were repeatedly tested across time. So you can see days of age across the x-axis and the antigen titer up the y-axis here. And particularly I want to focus on the serum testing, which is represented in the open symbols and the dashed or the dotted line. And what you can see is that where the animals were tested literally on the day of birth, which is right on the y-axis there, all of the animals were test positive. But then once these animals had been given colostrum, all of the animals actually tested negative on the serum ELISA for the first couple of days thereafter. And it was only actually at day 14 of age that all of these 5 animals actually tested positive on the serum ELISA. Turning now and looking at the biopsies, and in this case they did skin biopsies rather than ear biopsies, but basically same technique. Again, all of the animals tested positive before they got colostrum, but what happened was when they got colostrum, the titer actually declined by about 10 to 100-fold, depending on the animal. So you can see a drop in the titers in the first day or two, but in fact they all rebounded. But the really important message from this bit of research work is that with the skin biopsies, every animal tested positive on the ELISA, but on the serum, all of them tested negative for at least a couple of days post-birth. So it's just really reinforcing that in very young calves, the skin biopsy is going to be a better test than using serum in this case. And so people talk about the so-called diagnostic gap. So we have a situation where some animals using some tests test negative, and this is the so-called diagnostic gap. So the question we set out to answer with this research study was to ask the question, is there truly a diagnostic gap when we're testing calves using ear notches here in New Zealand? So what we did was enroll 11 spring calving dairy herds, and all of these herds had history of having persistently infected animals in the 2018-2019 breeding season. And in 8 of these 11 herds, we detected this through the bulk tank testing, and in 3 of these herds, we actually found a PI that was not a milking cow, but was associated with the herd. And this is, by this I mean either bulls or, in one case, a steer that happened to be running with the dairy herd that was actually a PI. So the point is, all of these herds had a PI animal in contact with cows during the breeding program in 2018-2019. And so what we did is we looked at the calves in the subsequent season, so when we expected PI calves to be born. And what we did was we went out to these farms every week for a period of about 12 weeks, and we tested animals that had been born in the last week, so what we're calling day 3 testing. The same animals were tested at day 10, a week later, and any newly calved animals were also tested at that time. So we had this kind of rolling maul of testing. We tested them all again at day 24 of age, plus or minus 3 days, day 38 of age. What we then did was we submitted all of the ear notch samples, and sorry, I should have pointed out, we did 2 ear notches, and one of the ear notches was tested by an antigen ELISA, and the second was tested by PCR. So all of the day 38, roughly 6 weeks of age, 5 to 6 weeks of age samples went in for testing. We got the results back, and any animal that was test positive, either on the antigen ELISA or on the PCR, we went back to the freezer and we got out the earlier samples, the day 3, the day 10 and the day 24 samples, and we tested all of those with the same tests. Any animal where we got a null test result, so there wasn't enough tissue to test, and this was a very small number of animals, but we actually went back and retested them again and tested those. And then finally, any animal that was test positive at day 38, either by the ELISA or by the PCR, we went out at approximately 100 days of age, so about 60 days later after the final test, and we drew a blood sample and we tested by ELISA for both antibodies and antigen. And I'll come back to why we did that in a minute. We also tested 10 to 15 calves out of each of the 10 of the herds, and we submitted that for IgG determination to test what the level of failure of passive transfer was in these herds. And the final thing we did was that if we had ear notch samples at day 3 or day 10 or day 24, but an animal failed to survive through to day 38, was sold or culled or died, we actually went and tested all those samples as well. So what we were worried about here was that our PI animals might have died or been culled or sold before we got to day 38. So we tested all of those animals that we started testing on but dropped out of the study, didn't make it to day 38, and I'll come back to them at the end. And just to reinforce the point, if you like, that these herds were pretty hot. This is just a screenshot of a PDF of one of the herds that was enrolled. This was not the worst offender, but a pretty bad herd. And the point here is that this herd's had high or very high BVD antibodies in the bulk tank over a period of 4 or 5 years before we started. And it has also had PIs in the milking herd, as shown by the red vertical arrows, over multiple years. And in this particular herd, they did go in and intervene. So, for example, in spring 2016, they were PI positive a couple of times. They went in, found an offender, got rid of her, and they were then bulk tank PI negative later on in the 2016-2017 lactation. And similarly in 2018-19, they did the same thing. They had a couple of PI positives. They went on a PI hunt and hauled PIs out. But you know, in this particular herd, obviously there's a risk that there were going to be calves born in the 2019-20 season, which is the one we worked in, for animals to be PIs. We used ear-notch sampling system. We used the Z-taggers, which not all of you will be familiar with, but you know, an ear-notch based system based on a pair of ear tag pliers, but with an adapter in it, with a male sleeve and a female pouch. And we had QR codes and unique identities for every individual sampled. Now, just to go back to the age of sampling for a minute, you know, I've talked about day 3, 10, 24, 38, and so on, but we actually got the calving dates for as many of the animals as we could, and there were a few missing, unfortunately, due to inaccurate recording. But the point here is that when I say day 3, they are actually an average of 4.5 days, more or less. When I say day 10, they're actually an average of about 11.5 days, and so on. So, you know, they're a day or two later than their nominal days of age. Going to the lab tests for a minute. For the ear notches, we use the erns antigen capture ELISA for the ELISA test, and then we use the real-time PCR and again the IDEX test for this. So the ear notches both went through both of these tests. For the blood tests that we did out at day 100, we used 2 different antibody tests, so the total and the P80 antibody test, and then the antigen test was actually the same as we used for the ear notch. And just to point out, we used the standard IDEX testing methodologies. The team down in Palmerston North did all the testing following their normal test protocols and their normal test cut points. And they gave us the results as a yes, no, test positive, test negative, but they also gave us the actual CT values for the real-time PCR and the ELISA S to N. So we've actually got the raw data as well as the yes-no data. Turning firstly to the failure of passive transfer data, about 30% of the calves that we tested, the subset of calves we tested, did have failure of passive transfer, but flipping that around, 70% of calves did receive you know, sufficient colostrum to have more than 10 grams a litre of IgG. So, you know, very much like previous New Zealand studies, clearly evidence of failure of passive transfer in some of these herds, and huge variation between herds in just how poor the colostrum management truly was. Now, just to define some of the terms I'm going to use, so I'll start talking about persistently infected animals shortly, and what I mean by these is that these are antigen test positive, so ELISA and PCR test positive at day 38, at week 5 or 6, and also serum antigen positive on the ELISA at day 100. So that's what I mean by PI, 2 tests, more or less 60 days apart. For the transiently infected animals, what we mean here is that they were test positive about day 38, so week 5 or 6 of age, but they were not antigen positive at day 100. They were test negative on the antigen ELISA at day 100. So we've defined them as transiently infected. And then what I'm going to call not infected are animals that were test negative both on the ELISA and the PCR at day 38. So that's a test negative animal on both tests. And we did some fairly basic descriptive analysis, and I'll show you the so-called violin plots in a minute. We tabulated the data as test positive or negative, and we then did estimations of just how confident we are. So we've got 95% confidence intervals around sensitivity estimates. And then we got a bit smarter, and I'll show you in a minute, using more sophisticated models, so linear mixed models and receiver operator curves, to look at the raw ELISA and PCR data to try and just see how good these tests are to split between PIs and TIs and negatively infected animals. Sorry, drink water. So after an enormous amount of work and many thousands, I think we collected about 13,000 ear notches in the end. We had 1,100 odd animals that we had good, analysable data on. 5 of those, or 0.5% roughly, were persistently infected. 22 or 2% were transiently infected, and the great majority, 97.5%, were negative on the day 38 tests. And just to give you a feel for that by herds, we had 11 herds, as I've mentioned. 5 of the 11 had evidence of transiently infected, and you can see the numbers there, number of calves and percentage of calves. And 3 of the herds had PIs. And I'll come back to why we might have got TIs but not PIs later on. Just looking at the individual test results from some of the PI animals, just to show you the raw data, as it were. So each line in this table represents one calf. So we've got the herd, the calf ID, the status, so these are PIs, and then we've got the test results of day 3, 10, 24, 38, and day 100, and we've got the ELISA and the PCR results at each time point. So for the ELISA, positive is obviously positive. For PCR-D, just means it's detected. So reported as a lab saying, yep, we found evidence of RNA for this particular, for pestivirus, for BVD in the ear notch of these animals. And so what's really striking about the results from these 5 animals is that they would test positive for ELISA and PCR for antigen every time we tested them, whether it was day 3, day 10, day 24, day 38, or day 100, we always got a test positive. Now, one animal was ungrateful enough to die on us before we got back to day 100, and I actually spoke to the herd owner about that scungy little horrible calf that was just chronic poor doing and unfortunately died before we got back to it. So, really clear evidence. If they were test positive day 38, they were test positive at every other time point. One of the interesting findings here was that if we look at the day 100 antibody test results, 3 of the 4 animals that we actually did get a day 100 sample on tested positive for the antibody. So, what we think is happening here is that we've had persistence of maternal antibodies despite, or even though there is these animals are persistently infected. So quite interesting that maternal antibodies certainly persist out at least to a day 100 in these almost definitely persistently infected animals. Looking at the transiently infected animals, here's just 3 test results from some animals in one herd. And the point I just want to make here is that these animals, by definition, tested positive day 38. In this case, they were all PCR positive on day 38. They were all antibody positive at day 100, but antigen negative at 100. So, clearly exposed to the virus, have seroconverted, virus is gone, very straightforward. Interestingly enough, too, the 3 of these animals tested positive on the PCR before day 38. So, but negative 1 or 2 other time points. So it's interesting that we're seeing the virus there multiple times, which is not really what I expected to see. In terms of some more interesting TIs, you get things like loss to follow-up. So this particular animal in the top table here was PCR positive once at day 3, but negative thereafter. And unfortunately, we didn't get back at day 100 to look at that animal. And then on the next table down, you can see an animal here that was PCR positive at day 38, but in fact was negative on both antibody and antigen at day 100. In fact, we had 2 calves did this. So it's just an interesting question here that the PCR is just so sensitive, potentially a false positive here because they were antibody and antigen negative at other test times. And there were a couple of animals, as I say, that behave like this. So just sort of summarising the split between the TIs and the PIs, all of the TIs that we found were actually positive on the PCR, but negative on the antigen ELISA. So we got complete separation of the test results for the TIs. So all the TIs, tested positive only on PCR, but never on the antigen ELISA. For the 17 animals of the TIs, we were able to get day 100 follow-up samples. 14 of these 17 were antibody positive, which is kind of what we'd expect. They're seroconverted. But conversely, one of them had an unclear antibody result, and 2 of them were antibody negative. So one of the corollaries around this, and flipping back to the TI versus PI discussion for a minute, is that the PCR had a higher sensitivity because for TIs, because it was finding the TIs where the ELISA wasn't. But the question is, if we're on a PI hunt compared to a TI hunt, then the PCR is actually more specific. The ELISA is more specific. It's only throwing up, it's only giving us test positives out of the PIs, not the TIs. Whereas if we use PCR, we're picking up both the persistently infected, but also the transit infected animals. And we'll come back to that discussion a little later. Now I'm going to walk you through a thing called the violin plot, which some of you may not have seen before, and I actually thank Andrew Weir for introducing me to these, because he used them last year at DCV, and I thought that's a really nice way of providing information. So just to walk you through what a violin plot is, it's the plot on the left of the screen as you're looking at it, and what we've got up the y-axis is actually the signal to noise ratio. So the higher the number, the stronger the test result, if you like. And then across the x-axis, we've got day 3, day 10, day 24, day 38, so each of the time points. And we've also got the ultimate status of the calf, whether it's negative, TI, PI, and so on at each of those time points. So what I want you to have a look at for a minute is that the negatives and the TIs are all down at 0. So there's a little circle with a little horizontal line, and that's basically saying all of those test results are very, very close to 0. But if we look at the PIs, what you can see here, and I'll try and build for me. Whoops, sorry, move too quickly. What you'll see in this kind of blob of colour is a little white circle, and that's the median value. So for day 3, the PIs had a median value, S to N, a bit over 2. And then you'll see there's kind of a solid whisker around the median, and that's the upper and lower quartile range. And then there's a finer line projecting above and below the quartile range, and that is what's called the upper adjacent value. So 1.5 times the interquartile range is effectively what that is. So it's just giving us a bit more idea of spread. And then the shaded area can be thought about. It's what's called a kernel density plot, but you can think about it almost like a histogram turned on its side. It's actually giving us the distribution of the test results over the range. And so it really gives you a really clear idea of what the test results actually look like. The other thing you may notice is that, in fact, in all 4 days, you'll see a little blob of results that are sitting down below the main group. So there were 1 or 2 animals that tested a little lower at each time point, and this violin plot, this analysis has picked those out as outliers. Now, the other graph that I've got on this table is what's called a receiver operator curve, and that's on our right-hand side here. And what this has got is the sensitivity up the y-axis, so the true test positive rate, and then on the y-axis is the false positive rate, or the 1 minus specificity, for those of you who want to think about it that way. And so what this graph is showing us is that if we draw a line in the sand, if we draw a cut point across the signal to noise ratio back on the other graph, for example, we can start with a really low cut point. We can start ridiculously at a cut point of 0 and just say anything with a cut point of 0 and above we'll call test positive. Now, obviously that's highly sensitive because we get every animal, but of course the specificity is complete rubbish because we're picking up all of the all of the truly negative animals are above 0, if you follow the logic. So we get all of the animals that are true test negative and TIs become false positive tests. But as we move the cut point up and up and up, so we go to example to 0.3, for example, and you draw a line across on the left-hand side graph, basically what that means is that all of the TIs, the transiently infected, and all the negatives are below 0.3, and all of the persistently infected animals are above 0.3. So in fact, we've got complete and perfect separation between the PI animals, because they've got a signal-to-noise ratio above 0.3, and all of the TIs and the negatives are below the cut point. So what that means is on the receiver-operator curve, we've got, as I've highlighted here in red, our graph goes right across to 1, which means we've got 100% sensitivity, and it's got a 0 false positive rate if you read down on the x-axis. So we've got, in this case, a perfect test. So the ELISA is perfectly discriminating between the persistently infected animals and the transiently infected and the negative animals. Using the same sort of graphs, this is the PCR results. So on the left-hand side, we've got the so-called violin plot, the CT on the y-axis, and as before, we've got day and status on the x-axis. Now, with the CT score, it's a little different. So with the CT score, high is close to 0, if you want to think about it, and the lower the number, the more likely the test is to be positive. So it just means within the PCR process that they're getting a signal at a lower number of replications of the test, so of the PCR process. So low means a strong signal. So the PI animals, persistently infected animals, you can see have a lower CT score than the transiently infected. Now, the negatives are not in here because they never get a CT score. They just get a null score because they never turn up on the PCR test result. So, again, we've got quite good separation between the PIs and the TIs, except for on day 10, we had one transiently infected animal that had the same CT point as a PI animal on that day. So we've got a problem. We don't have completely perfect separation. It's very, very close, but it's not perfect separation. So our receiver operator curve on the right-hand side looks pretty good. We've just got that tiny little step in the top left corner of that graph. So the PCR is pretty good at separating out TIs and PIs, but it's not perfect. Now, we went on and analysed the signal-to-noise ratio and the PCR by using more sophisticated statistics, because what we're interested in understanding is whether the strength of the signal, so the signal-to-noise ratio for the ELISA or the CT, changed across time because of some of the earlier work, and I showed you the German work, showing that the signal, the strength of the test, was lower in animals very close to calving. So what we were kind of expecting to see was that the separation between the TIs and the PIs and the negatives would not be as good down at day 3 as it was at day 38. But what you can see by looking at these graphs is that the PI animals in the orange really had very similar test results at day 3 and day 10 and day 24 and day 38. So basically, it didn't matter when we tested these animals, we got a signal from the assays, being equally strong. So there was no really strong time effect. So it wasn't like the day 3 test results were different from the day 10 or day 24 or day 38. So it's just showing us that the tests are performing equally as well, whatever time, day of age these calves were. So just starting to pull all of this information together, and I'm sorry I've thrown a lot at you. We had a relatively low incidence of PIs in the 1,100 odd calves we tested. We only found 5 PIs, so about 0.5%, and only 3 of the 11 herds did we actually find PI animals. Now, when we started thinking about it, this is probably not surprising. And the reason for that is that all of these herds had a long history of having PI animals or having high bulk tank antibodies. So basically what we think is that a very high proportion of the herd, 2/3 to 3/4 of the animals in these herds had been exposed to the virus and had seroconverted, probably well before there was a PI in the herd in the 2018-19 season. So what that means is there are actually relatively few naive animals in these herds, which would then allow the creation of a PI when that naive animal came in contact with the PI in these herds. So there was only a small pool of naive animals in the first place. Some of them would have been exposed when they were 30 days pregnant, or even before they got pregnant, and would have seroconverted, so they couldn't have created a PI. And some of them may have been exposed to the virus after day 120 when the calf was immunocompetent. So, we've only got this little window in which a PI calf can be created, and we've only got a small number of animals, that cows in this case, that could actually generate a PI calf. So we're not really that surprised with those results. But we did have a couple of herds where we had transient infected animals, but we couldn't find the PIs. Now, this may be because the PI animal was actually in the bobby calves. So remembering, and probably I didn't make the point clearly enough, but we focused on the keeper calves because they were going to stay in the herd long enough for actually us to repeatedly test them. So if there was a PI in the bobbies, we wouldn't have found it. So, there may well have been PIs in the bobby herd that we just never tested, we never saw, and they obviously went off farm at 4, 6 or 8 days of age. We also, I mentioned earlier, we were concerned that maybe the PIs died before we got to day 38. In fact, none of the animals that got lost in the study, that removed from the study before day 38, that we went back and tested, none of those were PI animals. So that was, being a persistent infected animal was not a risk factor for removal, interestingly enough, out of these herds. So just coming in and thinking about TI versus PI again, one of the things is that the ear notch tests, whether it was the PCR or the ELISA, were very good at separating out TIs and PIs and negatives. So, the true PI animals tested positive both to the ELISA and the PCR at all time points. And there was no reduction in the sensitivity of that testing in the younger animals. So, we're very confident that we can find the PIs either with the ELISA or the PCR. So, it's just reinforcing this message. It doesn't really matter how old the calves are. But going back to that question about what we're trying to achieve, are we trying to find any animal that's carrying the virus, so both the PIs and the TIs, or are we just trying to find the persistently infected animals? And it's an interesting question. If we want to find all the virus-carrying animals in a group of calves, then we'd use the PCR because that's more sensitive. It's going to pick up both the transient infected and the persistently infected animals, and we can get rid of those. Well, we've got a choice. We can either retest all of the PCR test positives at some later point in time. And if they remain positive, we'll assume they're PIs and get rid of them. If they go test negative, we'll assume that they were transiently infected and we'll leave them in the herd. So that's one option you've got. If a farmer only wants to test once and get rid of the persistently infected animals, then using the ELISA may be the way to do it, because it'll only, at least in our hands, it'll really only pick up the persistently infected animals. The transiently infected animals fly under the radar screen with the ELISA, and we just don't see them. Now, one of the questions is, well, if we went down the pathway of just using the ELISA, on the ear notches and we miss the TIs, does it matter? So if we've got a TI animal, we get rid of the PIs and we've got a TI there, is that TI itself, is the transient infected animal itself going to transmit infection? And the short answer is it appears no. There's been a number of studies in Scandinavia back in the early 2000s where they deliberately created TIs by taking a small group of calves that were naive. They put a persistently infected animal in. They monitored those animals. They found when the virus had transmitted. And then they took that TI animal and put it into another group of naive calves. And what they showed was that there was no transmission by the transiently infected animal to other animals in that same cohort. So what it appears to be saying is that the transiently infected animals are actually relatively poor transmitters of BVD. They're infected because the tests show they are, but they're not very good at spreading virus. So it may be that, you know, missing the odd TI in a herd really doesn't matter in the greater scheme of things. In terms of optimal testing time, you know, the BVD steering committee is saying let's test younger rather than older, and there's very good reasons for that. There has been this concern around, you know, testing too young, potentially because of maternal antibodies interfering. You know, we've shown in this data set that that really doesn't appear to be the case. And when we start looking at what's happening overseas, all of the international programs do recommend testing of calves. And when we look at the specific programs, for example, the Swiss and the Germans mandate that testing occurs when calves are less than 7 days of age, so less than 7 days of age. The Irish say less than 20 days, but they actually say as soon as possible. So, you know, at the international level, you know, testing of calves at a very young age by ear notch, by ELISA, you know, appears to be the default standard. You know, and you know, there's some advantage in doing that. You find those animals, get rid of them, you're reducing the possibility that PI animal can then cause issues with both the cohort of calves they're living with, but also potentially with any other pregnant animals in the herd. So, you know, we really see some opportunities here. You know, perhaps offering ear notching in conjunction with calf dispudding. We've got techs on farm doing the dispudding, so why not just get them to take ear notch pliers and do ear notching at the time? You know, techs keep good records, they're pretty thorough. It's actually a real opportunity to make sure that we do get that testing done, and hopefully that'll increase testing across the industry. So, you know, it could be a good thing. So, you know, the countervailing argument is, well, why don't we test later? And, you know, historically the argument's been that'll reduce negative tests because of maternal antibodies. That may or may not be true. But of course, as I've outlined, there are certainly increased risk of transmission. The longer we wait till we get in and intervene, the higher the risk that transmission is going to occur in that herd, either to, as I say, either other calves or more importantly, to pregnant animals. So, you know, just trying to pull that all together, you know, testing of calves appears to be a good strategy. It's a recommended strategy. You know, ideally, every herd would test every incoming calf. You know, I'm aware that farmers see it as a cost and push back on that. But one of the recommendations that Andrew Weir made, based on some of his analysis of the Eltham herds, was that we should obviously be testing calves in a herd where there's been a PI last season, but also if the bulk tank signal-to-positive signal-noise ratio goes up by more than 0.3, even if a PI is not found, that may indicate there's active infection going on in that farm, even though the PI wasn't identified. But that might be a signal that there may be a PI calf born next season. We really should get in and sort those calves out. So really, you know, where this data, this study seems to be heading is to suggest that, you know, if a calf's a day or two old, you know, maternal antibodies, at least the way we tested them, did not appear to affect particularly, well, both the ELISA and the PCR sensitivity. Now, this is kind of countervailing with some of the earlier data, New Zealand data, but one of the points to note is that the ELISA test has actually changed since that earlier work's done. So the test has actually become more refined since some of the earlier research work was done, which potentially gives us more confidence in the test results now. And just before I finish up, I'd certainly like to acknowledge the herd owners and staff who put up with our team being out there every week for right through spring, a really busy period of time. The tech team, so both the Cognosco, my tech team and the IDEX lab team who processed a huge number of samples for us, and the people who paid the bills, which is the IDEX team. So big shout out to them. So with that, I'm going to come back to the general screen. And look, I'm now open for any questions. So you can either type your questions into the little scroll bar down the bottom, or preferably you can unmute yourself. So just turn off the little microphone symbol in the bottom left and fire away, and I'll try and answer any questions that you may have.
Scott, is LIC likely to accept results from other labs to put into Minder at any point? Has there been any progress on that?
That's a good question. I can't answer that. What I can say is LIC are aware of this data. We shared this data with them. There was some robust discussion, shall we say, about what these test results mean. We now are aware, and I wasn't aware earlier on, that the ELISA, so even though the ELISA name is the same, the test was optimized, validated since the earlier research work that Heinrich was involved, which may, and I'm not totally, but it may explain why we seem to have these kind of differences between these studies. So I can't and won't answer for LIC, but what I will say is, yep, they're well aware of this study, and we've talked through with them what we think the implications are. So, the ball is in their court as to whether they'll take those test results into Minder. But of course, we can use the test results and work with them with our clients. So there's questions come in on the chat group around changes in the bulk milk tests jumping around. And that, particularly late in the season, may be volume related. And I know Andrew Weir, and I don't know whether, Andrew, you're still on the call. You may want to butt in and have your 2 bobs worth. But Andrew's recommendation, based on the analysis he did of a huge number of test results from his Eltham client base, was that if the S to P or S to N jumped by more than 0.3, so for example went from 0.6 to 0.9, that should be a signal that maybe the herd's been exposed to a PI animal, even though it may not have turned up test positive on the bulk tank. So that was the recommendation from Andrew. So Andrew, do you want to comment? Come online, turn your mute off and comment on that.
Yeah, the guideline I normally go by is if I see an increase of 0.3 or more, then I'll call the client and I'll just let them know that there's been an increase. It could be because of late lactation effects or things like that. But usually if it gets to the 0.3 value, that's usually because there's been some exposure somewhere. We're not worried about a PI because we have the spring results that show that there was no PI present in the spring. In the vat, like in the milking herd, it's really just a case of we need to make sure that the calves next season are tested, because that's where your big risk is, that a PI will be born next year, and then whatever has already happened will then potentially turn into a disaster. So that sort of increase, that's the way I normally deal with it.
Okay, well, thanks for those comments. There was a question around, and I just really need to clarify, have we been talking about ear notch or serum testing? Just to be absolutely clear, all of the results that I presented to you this afternoon were based on the ear notch. So we're certainly not advocating that you use ELISA or in fact PCR on serum samples on the younger animals necessarily, although the PCR should be fine. But it's the ear notching specifically that we've been talking about. And that fits with the overseas data. The original studies where there was concern about this so-called diagnostic gap often looked at the serum, and it was the serum ELISAs where animals that were subsequently shown to be persistently infected tested negative on the serum ELISA when they were very young. And, we're talking a few days of age. So, yeah, just to be absolutely clear, what I've been talking about is the ELISA on the ear notch in these young calves is fine to find the persistently infected animal. Now, you can still use PCR. PCR is fine, but the point I've been trying to make is that if you use PCR, you'll find more test-positive animals because you'll find the virus. But at least in our case, 80% of the animals that we found with PCR that were test-positive were transiently infected. And the point I was trying to make is I'm not sure I care too much about those TIs. They may disappear of their own accord, and it may not matter. If you want a real belt and braces and you want to get rid of the virus out of the herd, then yep, PCR is fine. But if we're truly on a PI, persistently infected animal hump, then the ELISA actually seems to be doing a really good job. Someone's just asking about bobby calves. Yeah, I mean, if we test all the bobby calves, would we have increased prevalence? Yeah, possibly. But do we have any reason to believe that a bobby calf would be more or less likely to be a PI than a keeper calf? I'm not sure about that. I mean, I guess at herd level, the more calves we tested, the more likely we are to find a PI. So it may have been, of the 11 herds, if we test all the bobbies as well as the keepers, we might have found more test-positive animals, so the herd prevalence would have gone up. I'm not sure that the individual animal prevalence, so the number of heifers within that keeper group, or sorry, the number of calves within the total calf group would be any higher if we tested all of the calves, including the bobbies, compared to just the keeper calf. I mean, I guess if you hypothesize that bulls might have brought BVD in and that some of the keeper calves were beyond the 110-day mark and were less likely to become infected, yeah, possibly. But yeah, I wouldn't bet on it actually. So, Andrew's comment. Andrew, we make it generally is PIs are small, more likely to be bobby. Yeah, I guess that's a good point. So, yep, that is a good point.
Scott, Roger Ellison here.
How are you, Roger?
Good, thanks. Just
good.
From a steering committee point of view, obviously
yep.
We've been talking about the 35-day period.
Sure.
N equals 5. If you're in the steering committee, I guess our concern is missing anything. Just wondering about 5 animals in this study, how strong do you think that makes that study in terms of?
Yeah, I mean, that's a valid point, Roger. The 95% confident intervals around N equals 5, if we'd only done 5 tests at day 38 and that's all we'd done, and you put a 95% confidence interval of 5 out of 5, then the 95% confidence interval is between 48% and 100%, right? And if we only had 5 test results, that's a valid point. But we've actually got, and I'm going to be a bit careful what I say here, we've got 5 animals and we've repeatedly tested them. Now that, and I'm absolutely clear about that, you know, doing 2 tests on 5 animals at 5 time periods, which is what we did, gives us, you know, 50 data points. Now that's not 50 independent data points, and I'm, you know, absolutely agree with that. But, you know, if we put confidence intervals out of around 50 out of 50, then our confidence intervals are getting up to, you know, 90 something odd % in there. So, you know, would I like more animals? Absolutely. So when we set up this study, I was, you know, I was certainly aiming, we hoped to get 20 odd animals that we would have 4 or 5 tests on, or sorry, 10 tests on. We were hoping to get 200 test positives, which we obviously didn't get. So yeah, I mean, I absolutely, and you know, the German work also had N equal, you know, the Fux study that everybody quotes, the 2012 study, had N equals 5 animals, and you know, you take that for what it's worth. So would I like more animals? Yes, I would. Am I reasonably confident around the results? Yeah, I'm 90, 95, 99% plus confident that these results are sensible. And you know, the one outlying study in here, yes, it had 11 animals, but it was using a different test, and it was under, you know, somewhat different physiological circumstances. Now, that's not to say that those circumstances wouldn't be replicated in other herds that had 0 failure of passive transfer. You know, if we had 0 failure of passive transfer, you could argue there's more antibodies around, and therefore we're more likely to get test interference. That may be true. The other point I'd make is that if we did have a failure, you know, hypothetically, we tested everything at ear notch time, at the spudding time when the calves are 14 days old, for example, and we missed one animal, what is the implication of that? The implication is that we've missed a PI, we've got a PI in that group. It potentially could then obviously create a PI in the rising 2-year-olds when they're bred at 15 months of age. So we could then introduce, you know, a PI into the milking herd, and, you know, all the sequelae to that. But I guess the point I'd make is that, and I'm certainly not suggesting, and I know the BVD steering committee is not suggesting that the only test we ever do in a herd is the calves. You know, we're testing calves within the context of a program, not just testing calves. So, you know, certainly not advocating you test calves and stop doing bulk tank testing, or stop testing heifers that are coming home from grazing and so on. So the point I'm making is that, you know, if it's not a perfect test, and I'm not claiming it is, if it's not a perfect test, and, you know, 1 in 1,000 PIs or 1 in 100 PIs, whatever the number is that we might miss by testing at a younger age, what is the impact of a false false negative test in this case? And what I'm suggesting is we've still got other fallback systems. So the whole program, you know, as the BVD steering committee have outlined, should deal with that. So the issue is, at the moment, and I actually had a look at our own test data, and I'm embarrassed to admit this publicly, but we're only testing about 5% of the calves in our practice. 5%. 95% of our calves are not being tested. So I would argue that if we can move that to 20% by saying, look, we've got technicians on farm doing dispudding at, you know, 10, 14, 20 days of age, with a test that we're reasonably confident with, that has got to be leading the industry forward, rather than waiting until we're testing the bulk tank at 2 years of age, which is what 95% of our farmers are doing. In fact, it's not even that. Probably 50% of our farmers are doing bulk tank testing. So 50% are doing nothing at all, 50% of bulk tank testing, and over 5% are testing calves. So the point I'm trying to make is that if we could get more calf testing, that would be a good thing for the industry. Comments, Roger?
I'll just mute me again. Very impressive. Yes, no, good answer, and it's certainly given the steering committee some good facts to work towards.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I mean, I'd love to go and test a few 10,000 more calves. So depending on how deep the coffers of the BVD steering committee is, I'll bleed a whole bunch more calves for you, mate.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments before we wrap up? I'm just cognizant we've gone over time.
If there is no other comments, Scott, on behalf of everybody who's been on this meeting, I'd just like to say thank you for taking the time in your busy schedule to present this data, and you know, everybody else once again for taking time out of their busy schedule to join us for this update. So thank you.
Oh, well, thanks everybody for joining us, and yeah, hope everybody got something out of it. So thanks very much for joining the party. Cheers.